Yeah. Well, in the interest of time, even though we don't have a quorum, we can set aside the minutes and see if we get another member to join and we can review the minutes. But I thought that we could go ahead and have some dialogue about the Reboot Norman plan. Daryl, I don't know if you or Catherine, or I don't know who wants to talk through that with us. I've got some little grammatical things and then some bigger questions about who does and doesn't qualify. And I don't know if that's something that you want to walk us through, Daryl, or who you prefer to do that.
Let me click back over and Sarah, do you have that where you can share the screen and we can just kind of walk our way through it? Oh, Sarah, you're on mute.
She gave us the thumbs up, so she's...
Excellent. So we'll screen share that. We'll all look at the same thing, walk our way through it. So Chuck, as we're going through it, by all means, fire away any comments you have, and we will be correcting that document. Based on today's comments, we'll recirculate it, have anybody email us back any final comments, and it's a conversation we can agendize for council's consideration on the 11th, or because I think our next council meeting after the 11th is the 25th, and that's election day. That may be a little late. So we can take these final comments and go forward, along with communication in the staff report to council that we are going to continue to pursue CARES Act funding through the governor's office and the federal EDA funding with the assistance of Commissioner Stacy and Widow Bryant, their consulting firm that's plowing through that information on our behalf. So multiple fronts, and all those efforts will continue to make sure our local tax dollars are the last available resource.
That's great.
So push the button when you're ready, Sarah. There it goes. Got it. Okay. So as we begin to scroll upwards, the overview, just highlighting the $5 million ballot question on the August 25th, 2020 ballot. Eligible entities, this has been modified based on our prior EDAB conversation. Locally owned and locally managed organizations based in the city limits of Norman with 50 or fewer employees. Where applicable, organizations are up to date on all required licensing. It varies by business type what those licenses are. Legal to operate in the city of Norman before funds are distributed. Those entities are not, for those entities not current on any city permits, past due amounts may be deducted from the total amount of the request just to make them eligible. Then they can have the balance of the request. Existing organizations eligibility must have been in operation prior to March 13th. And then organizations that were not in operation by that date would be considered startup and may be eligible for funding in a different category. So I think that was the definition that we had put together based on Sarah's original language and then modified through our last EDAB meeting. Eligible entities, operations and or employees located for ineligible. Oh, there we go. There's the eligible, the ineligible, the majority of operations or employees outside of Norman. I don't even know if there's a way to verify that, to tell you the truth. That's an interesting line on the ineligible side.
And I wouldn't mind addressing a few of these as we go along.
Please.
And I'm aware of some family-owned businesses that are headquartered in Norman that are locally owned, fully owned by locals, but because of their workforce and because of their desire to live in a more vibrant community, they live other places and commute to Norman. And so those businesses under this particular sentence would say, you know, where a majority of the operations or employees are located outside the city limits of Norman. I would want to address that differently in some way, because
So
if
maybe
you've
we
got,
strike employees.
I think that would be, I would certainly support that, but I'd be open to comments from other members of our committee. And then I would say that, I don't know whether or not you would want to say Johnson Controls, for example, is probably one of the pillar organizations of our community, and certainly one of the largest employers of our community. But certainly Johnson Controls is a global company, and whether Johnson Controls would, obviously they have more than 50 employees. For example, they're a part of an organization that has the majority of their operations outside of the city limits of Norman, but they certainly are a key player in the local economy here. And so there could be a company like that has local managers, and they have things going on here, but they also are part of so when we say locally owned and locally managed business, entities, organizations, we're covering that process. I mean, I know there are
and that may be because we've got the 50 or fewer employee cap. Maybe we don't need to list that in terms of maybe the fact that we include it as eligible. Anything that doesn't meet that criteria is automatically ineligible. So over 50 employees or based outside the city limits, I think that makes perfect sense. This in the ineligible category may cause more confusion than it clears.
Right. And I think, just from a dialogue standpoint, I believe clearly the committee is aware of the council's desire to have this first go to underserved populations, or I think our committee's desire, based on past dialogue, is that we'd like to find opportunities where these needs had fallen through the cracks. And so the more narrow we define this, the more likely we might just write ourselves out of an opportunity that we'd like to have, somebody that we didn't think of before. And obviously public and private schools, okay. Church, religious organizations, okay. It's municipal, taxpayer money, and elected officials. I mean, I think we're doing pretty well, but I'm glad we're taking out descriptors of the eligibility for the entities that could be applied.
I think you're right. It's better to keep that a little more broad, and then the ineligible pieces, illegal activities, organizations that are engaged in political. I think the balance of what we have left are honestly would be more typical of government funding for loan type activities. Real estate development or rental property business.
Before we leave that, I'm so sorry to interrupt.
No
says
problem.
Organizations engaged in any illegal activity. From the committee standpoint or the council standpoint, I want to discuss whether or not this is something that we should talk about, what's legal in Oklahoma versus what's legal nationally, because as a bank, a federally insured financial institution, we're prohibited by law from doing business with anything that is federally illegal. And so that means that banks, FDIC insured banks, cannot do business with marijuana related entities because it's federally illegal. But I know that Oklahoma, it's legal in Oklahoma. So if we did want to say, those local businesses are in business and they might have a need, that we might want to say organizations engaged in any illegal activity in Oklahoma.
As defined. Yes, yeah. I think that's absolutely valid.
Yeah. Okay. And I don't know exactly how you word that, but I think if it's illegal in Oklahoma, then it should be eligible. And, there are things that are illegal on the federal level that are legal in Oklahoma.
And I think that once again, it may, as worded, could deter somebody who is operating a business that is legal to operate in Oklahoma, but they may recognize it. It's illegal federally, and this is not federal money, under this program. So
Right.
illegal organizations engaged
What
in
if we
any
took,
illegal
what if
business
we took
activity as
that,
defined by.
yeah, what if we took that sentence and moved it to the eligible side and just say organizations engaged in legal activities in Oklahoma? And that way
Yep.
it's on the plus side. And that way somebody reading it that had, they were a grower or whatever they were doing, they would see that, okay, well, this is a legal activity in Oklahoma. And then that way we're on the plus side rather than the ineligible side.
Yep. Yeah, and I think the ability to look for opportunities to help local businesses. We should be looking towards eligibility instead of looking towards ineligibility. I think that's a
Well,
great
yeah,
perspective.
yeah, well said.
Now, the real estate
I
development.
have a couple of quick questions. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, please.
Question one, related to marijuana businesses. Since this is going to be money granted out from the city, are we okay with that federally illegal piece? I mean, is that going to get us in any trouble, or are we clear as long as it just doesn't run through a FDIC bank?
From council's perspective, and I think once they began to permit these activities in accordance with state law, I think the council is very comfortable with the businesses operating legally here in the city of Norman. So I think that Oklahoma inclusion in the eligibility piece, and since it's local tax dollars, I don't anticipate any federal scrutiny taking place. Now, one of the things that Commissioner Stacy and his team have been working mightily on is our ability to access CARES Act money, which is federal dollars. Matt, I think the recognition that if we are able to access federal dollars, we may have a second sheet if there's a second flavor of money available, and we will have to address that because the CARES Act people may audit us and say, oh, time out, that loan's no good. You're going to have to repay that with local dollars or something. So thank you for that note. We will make note, and depending on the flavor of money, right now, first bite, local dollars, council will have the flexibility, and I think they have the appetite to support that industry. Great catch.
Great. Well said.
Second question, real quick. Sorry. The only thing that I didn't notice on this list, do we want to add anything about independent contractors? Because that was kind of a hang up where you had LLCs and you had independent contractors. My wife being one, she's a realtor. She's got her own LLC, but it's just her. So didn't know if we needed to clarify if they were eligible or ineligible. What do you guys think?
I would think, and because we did have that discussion at last EDAB, whether it was a sole proprietor, LLC, S Corp, Corp, or nonprofit. We weren't going to preclude anybody from participating based on that criteria. Because Mr. Francisco, we talked a little bit about, do we use SIC codes or something like that for eligibility? And Sarah, I don't believe that exists or does it exist further down in the document? I'm trying to remember.
No,
where we talk about LLCs and that kind of thing.
No.
I don't think we ever limited it or.
So do we leave it open, and do we list something in the eligibility side, locally owned and locally managed organizations based in the city limits of Norman, and maybe the next one, or it's a this may include LLC.
I don't mean to interrupt again, but we could add a sentence that says, because under Anthony's comments last time, we want to try to create as broad a opportunity as possible. So Matt, maybe we say any entity not specifically listed as ineligible can apply for these funds. And so if you're just like Daryl and Anthony said, if you're a sole proprietorship, a partnership, an LLC, a private contractor, whatever that might be, if it's not specifically listed as ineligible, then apply. So that might just help us not trip on, something. Because another thing to follow up on that comment, where it says on the ineligible, where it says we talked about whether or not a 501c6 would be eligible or not. And so, for example, Visit Norman is a 501c6. The Norman Chamber of Commerce is a 501c6. So if you scroll down a little bit, ineligible entities says primarily engaged in lobbying. And so even though most of the limitations have excluded 501c6 organizations on the other programs, the Chamber, Visit Norman, they are not primarily lobbying entities. They're service to members entities. And so it's by stating it that organizations that are primarily engaged in political or lobbying activities, there are some 501c6s that are primarily involved in that. So whoever is looking at the applications would say, all right, well, if an organization spends less than 5% of its revenues on lobbying activities, well, then that would certainly not be primarily engaged. But if somebody was a lobbying organization, they spent, more than 25% or whatever underwriting criteria we might apply, then they would be, eliminated from being eligible. So I'm pretty happy that Anthony led us away from designations as it relates to the IRS designations and more towards description of what we have in mind. Does that help, Matt?
No, I think that's good. I like that sentence about, hey, if you're not ineligible, then apply.
Yeah. Absolutely. Hey, for the committee, as I'm looking at this list, real estate development or rental property businesses, here's my thought, and it's a different thought this week than it was last week. There is a debate taking place in Washington right now as to whether or not any moratorium on evictions and or foreclosures will be extended beyond August 31st. Now, if you are a person in the rental property business, you're filing a tax return that says, I've got rental income, and your ability to make your mortgage payment on your rental property is based on your tenants paying you rent. So tenants stop paying you rent because they're unemployed because of the pandemic. Real estate development is like, in my opinion, maybe one aspect of this line item. Rental property, I don't know. I'm a little torn. Would we make a loan? Would it be our intent to make a loan to somebody that they could use this loan to, keep their mortgage current? This is almost like a second in that particular perspective. Chuck, you guys do mortgages. How does this line read, and what are your thoughts on that idea?
Well, that's just kind of some of the dialogue. I'm not in favor of that being ineligible, but I do think that real estate development and rental property businesses, when you look at COVID related, that's kind of the underlying theme here, is that these businesses that have been impacted. One of the things we talked about last time was that there was a criteria on some of the other programs we've looked at that their business had to have a 25% reduction in gross revenues, COVID related gross revenues. I like that situation. So now you're not, having people apply that weren't impacted. And so I think that might be something we consider. But I think if we say, your locally owned or locally managed business with 50 or fewer employees was negatively impacted related to COVID activities or COVID issues, then people that are ineligible are the list we have there. I think that whatever underwriting panel or however we decide to sort through these and give highest, I've seen a point system, where you create a point system that says, okay, well, people who have, these attributes get these kinds of points, and then you allocate the money out based on who, what applicants get the highest points. And so if somebody's got 10 rent houses and they just don't have very good tenants and they can't pay very well and they can't really prove that it's very COVID related, then I would think that would go to the bottom of the list. But if you had somebody that was providing, affordable housing to people that were working in restaurants or, other businesses that were directly negatively affected by COVID, then they'd score higher because their tenants were affected in that way. So I'm not in favor of saying just because it's real property that makes it not apply. I can see where a scoring of those kinds of applications could have them fall lower, on the score. But Hussein, you know a lot about this kind of real estate property. And anybody else, Chris or Matthew, have ideas or thoughts about what you'd like to see there?
Sure. Thanks, Chuck. I was actually going to chime in. I think we also need to kind of be careful with real estate developers because like home building has not been affected by COVID as far as on a large scale. We've actually been doing really well. But there are some smaller home builders that I know of who, especially like kind of the higher end of the market has become pretty soft, especially just given the oil and gas market happening at the same time as COVID. And then I think Chuck touched on this, which was if you're a mom and pop and you got, I don't know, 5 or 6 rental homes and 3 of them you count on students coming to OU or OSU or wherever. I mean, we're talking Norman specifically. So, maybe students aren't coming back to the university or things of that nature. It's just a little bit tougher for people who aren't necessarily kind of bigger organizations who can weather the storm. And then lastly, and again, Chuck kind of touched this too, let's say you've got a strip center and there's a bunch of restaurants in there. Well, we all know how Smith closed everything down and, for 3 months. But other smaller restaurant chains, maybe they weren't able to survive. And so you're just losing rents and you don't have other income to supplement that. Again, we were really lucky in the housing industry when we don't have that issue. But I've seen kind of now that the PPP and the unemployment and everything is running out, people are having a harder time paying their rents. And we're certainly working with all of our tenants. But I just don't know that everybody has the same financial ability to weather the storm that we do because we've got the other supplemental businesses and the home creation side of things. That's, again, been really, really well after a couple months. The first couple of months, I think, were scary for everybody. Even we had a pretty big drop in our numbers for about 6-8 weeks.
Would it be a true statement that when I see the real estate development, what I would not want to discourage is maybe I'm a sheetrock subcontractor and I've got 4 employees and maybe my business has slowed down because of COVID and just whoever my builders that I usually do business with aren't building as many homes. So when I think of real estate development, I'm thinking of somebody who, buys 60 acres and they put a plat on it and they subdivide it and they put in the streets and that kind of thing. You see that as, maybe not more than 50 employees, but definitely a larger organization. And I wouldn't want any of our trades who would have fewer than 50 employees to be discouraged from applying if their particular business could show that 25% reduction based on COVID. So yeah, I think real estate, it's a touchy line, and maybe each application will, find its own level of buoyancy in the pool of applicants just based on how they were able to communicate what the impacts of COVID-19 have been.
I mean, I'm really open to the, Chris and Matthew, but I'm a supporter of just striking that entire sentence. And
I am too.
Don't do it yet. But I mean, I think we should talk about that. But I do think that 2 things that we haven't talked about are, will we use this pool of money to offer support for people who can qualify under other larger, bigger programs. Because I do still think that the dialogue surrounding this was trying to find ways to support and help people who have fallen through the cracks, so to speak. And so if you can qualify under a CARES Act program, or you're sort of normal, then I think we intend as a community to help guide those impacted businesses, business people, toward what's best for them, and then leaving this $5 million municipal pool of funds as open and as flexible as possible. And I know you mentioned sheetrock. I know a small sheetrock contractor that had himself and 4 other people, and 3 of them got COVID. I mean, they got sick, and so he just had to wait for them to, he lost maybe about a month's worth of work. But so those are the things that just fall through the cracks in these other kinds of programs. And so I think if we leave this as open as possible, and I don't know, Matt, do you prefer Matt or Matthew?
Matt's fine.
Matt, okay. So Matt and Hossein and Chris, if you really want to keep that on, maybe nod or thumb up, but otherwise, I think we can just take that sentence off. Is that okay with everybody?
I'm fine with removing it because we've got caps for all of our programs. So I mean, my only concern would be if somebody's got a bunch of rental properties, they apply, well then that's going to drain our money. But all the different programs have caps. So, if it's we have a rental property. So it's like, if we've lost revenue, if we lost renters, like this would be a great opportunity should we need it. But I'm also, I don't have 30 properties that would completely drain this $5 million fund. So I think with the caps, we're fine. I agree with you that we want to leave it as open as we can.
Okay. All right. Well, then I saw Chris nod. So I think let's go ahead and Sarah and take that sentence out of there. And so now, and maybe back to you, Daryl, we had talked about before that a company that is eligible would have had some certain negative impact from the pandemic. And I didn't see that and I might not just have read it well enough, but I think that, if we say that, your gross revenues impacted by 25%, that's what I've seen in some of the other programs. So that way, you're dealing with somebody that's in need. I know under the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, there was no limitation on that. And we saw a lot of money go out to businesses it was good, and they got help with payroll, and they didn't know how it was going to work for them at the time, but they really didn't have any negative impact. And we're far enough now into the pandemic results of what's going on that we'll be able to see if a business has been negatively impacted by COVID or COVID related circumstances. And so I would like to see what others think about adding that criteria in that, the business.
Chuck, this portion of the document where we talk about priority considerations and what the scoring may look like, this could be a scenario where the greater the impact that is identified in the application, the higher you rise in the pool if we are oversubscribed. So maybe under priority considerations, we indicate that the highest priority will be given to applicants that demonstrated the greatest impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic.
The highest negative financial impact directly related
yes,
to pandemic. Pick a word there.
Do we want to clarify like month over month, or do we want to say compared to this time last year? Like, how do we determine what?
Good question.
I think the EIDL criteria had year over year comparisons. This time this year to this time last year, but some of them say prior to March. There's a March some date in March. But I think year over year would be reasonable. Matt, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I like that better. Go ahead, Sarah. You got your hand raised.
Yeah, can I just interject? I've had, a couple of businesses that were newer, so they didn't have previous years to compare, and even some that in like the Oklahoma Business Recovery Program, there was a couple of different time chunks you could use, and I have even some that couldn't demonstrate a 25%, because like they did really well in January and February because of the certain thing that they were doing, but so they couldn't actually demonstrate a loss from where they were now to that time period. Does that make sense? I'm not explaining that very well.
No, you did.
So very new businesses, they don't have a previous year. If they opened in January or November, they wouldn't have that statement. But and so I think we can get that information from the application. We can say, what were your and I hate to give it a specific time frame, because then also like seasonal businesses, I think we can put it in the application, like, how much, what was your revenue for this year versus this year, or give them a couple different options. I want to keep that part flexible, because I've heard some issues with that. For some
I think
of the other programs.
I agree. I think if we just let the applicant describe, the negative, and I would like to add the word greatest negative financial impact.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's valid.
Yeah, and let the applicant show their negative financial impact directly related to COVID, and then that way, as we evaluate the applications, we can look at those on a case-by-case basis. I think that's a great idea. Thank you, Matt, very much.
I might also add as a percentage of their business. So if you just said the greatest financial impact, some people might read it as the greatest dollar amount, not necessarily the greatest, if somebody $1 million in revenue and there's $100,000, or somebody's doing
related
10 million
related to their business. Yeah.
Right.
So after the word impact, put related to their business, or related to the business. Well said.
The second related, you could say from COVID-19. Directly related to the business from COVID-19 versus related. Just wordsmithing, thinking out loud.
And
or as a result of COVID-19, something like that. Resulting from COVID-19.
That's great.
Perfect. Yep.
Okay.
I like it. Let's scroll up, Sarah, and talk about our programs.
There are a couple of other, while we're kind of, if you want to go back to the top where it says locally owned and locally managed organizations based in the city limits of Norman. It's an S. Very first bullet right there, city limits of Norman.
Oh, yep. Excellent. Yeah, because spell check wouldn't have caught that one.
Yeah, right. And under priority considerations, where we went over that, if you can go to that section, there was some, and the second bullet, it says organizations that had restrictions. I'm not sure exactly what we were going to try to say there.
It would either be were restricted or had restrictions.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, that's cleaned up. And then I'm sorry. So keep going. I have a question and a thought about some of the limits under the proposed funding programs. So when we get there, yes. And Chris and Matt and Hassan, to speak up. We'll pause. So under this proposed funding program, if it's, let's say it's $5 million is what we have. And if it's going to be a revolving loan and they're going to pay it back, and the underwriting committee or process feels that repayment is going to happen, I'd be supportive of a higher level than 50,000, maybe 100,000 or 200,000. People who have less than 50 employees could still have a pretty high negative impact out of that. And I do know that we've talked about Visit Norman and the Norman Arts Council as possible applicants for these funds where they could use future revenues to repay the funds. So if it's a grant, then I think, yeah, smaller amounts. But if we think we can underwrite loans where we could have an interest rate, modest interest rate, and then recover the money with a return on that money, then maybe a higher level there would give us a little bit more impact.
And the underwriting criteria will give us the indication on the level of security in that repayment stream.
Yes.
And that's how we grow the fund over time to potentially provide greater protection to small businesses for future events, whether it be pandemic or natural disaster.
Exactly. Well, and there is a certain amount of efficiency with some larger limits, especially, for example, and I'm not saying that Norman Arts Council hasn't applied. I mean, this is not, I'm not talking about them without, well, you know what I mean? So, but I do think that if they can pledge future hotel motel room tax revenues and the city can allow that to happen, then they could, I think their impact, according to the director, was a few $100,000. And so if we want to try to make an impact in places like that, then we might want a higher limit, maybe up to $250,000 in money that's going to be repaid. But I don't know what the committee or the council would think about that.
I think the council's open to recommendations from EDAB.
Do we have an idea roughly of like what percentage we're kind of anticipating each of these four to be?
I don't think so, Matt. And I'm not sure if there is data from the demand in OKC that would help us maybe gauge that. We know the demand from OKC, they went through their first 5 million in a couple of weeks worth of applications, added another 5 million. And now it sounds like they're adding another 12 to it. So the demand is absolutely there. But I don't know if there's enough data, but I think that's where we would go look. We'd go look at OKC's applicant pool and see if they have any statistics they would share with us, non-business specific, but category specific. And is that the thought where we would say for the revolving loan fund, we want to put in $3 million for organizations with 50 or less, and then we put in $1 million for small business nonprofit loan recovery with 10 or fewer employees, and then you put in 500,000 for grants and 500,000 for technical assistance? Is that kind of the value of knowing the appetite for each one of the programs?
Yeah, that was my thought. Because that might help us determine what that highest limit is that Chuck was talking about. Like if we know generally we're going to be here, because I look at 50 and go, yeah, let's go to 250. But then I'm like, well, hold on, like, is that going to drain the whole fund? Or, do we want to have kind of relatively kind of set aside caps for each one of these categories, or assumptions maybe?
Well, and maybe we start out with some initial assumptions, and in our communication with council, the ability to say, hey, and if we see one of these programs receives a much greater level of application, that maybe EDAB has the flexibility to recommend moving some money from one program to another.
Well, do you think we could, and I completely agree, Matt, that looking at, well, how much would go in each bucket. I'm in favor of having the bigger buckets go to the loans that would be repaid, that would revolve our fund. And but we might have some guidelines, but not knowing what kind of applications we're going to get, I think we'd want to leave that, not tie ourselves down to that, but leave it open. And then, because I still think we'll have an underwriting panel. I mean, we haven't talked about how that would work, but and then, you know, if somebody's, if you got a big applicant that needs, that's asking for $250,000, but they haven't, you know, they don't really qualify, but they don't really have the impact to score high, then they're not going to, you know, we might say, well, 250 is too much, but based on your application and what you have, we could do 50,000 or 25,000, something like that. That might be, you know, something that we could do back to that. But I think having a high limit for money that can be borrowed and repaid might give us some sizzle, where we could do some bigger things for people that have had some significant negative impacts that haven't been able to find assistance in any other programs.
Well, and one of the things that we haven't talked about much, and Derry keeps hopping on and hopping off, but you know, what's going to be available at the county level too. So if it's somebody that has a much higher need, maybe that's just something we kick over to the county or something.
Yeah. Well, that's a great segue. Derry, I know that you had to have to run and do something else, but do you have a minute to brief us a little bit on what you've learned in the last little bit about this other money that might be available?
So that is changing as we speak. And I don't know, sorry, I was on calls earlier, so I don't know if you've already discussed this, or Daryl, if you've had a chance to brief them on the information that was sent out last night in regards to disbursement from CARES Act dollars for counties and cities. But
no, we were hoping you would join us, and so we just touched on the fact that we knew you were working on it with staff and with our consultants.
Yes, so very interesting how they determined how they were going to disperse the dollars to governments, counties, and cities. Having said that, I do not see the dollars that we were hoping for available for the program that we were discussing with our consultant. The National Treasury strongly suggested that 45% of those dollars should be used for local governments, and it is about half that or less that they have decided to disperse. So short of them actually putting more money into the pot, that's going to make it really difficult. However, I understand that he is holding back some money for business related, which we might be able to tap into those dollars that he's holding for state funds for business related. If we can come together and show a need on a county-wide level to try and put a program together to address some of that. So I'm sorry if I covered stuff you guys already talked about. And again, I apologize I was late, but it is absolutely changing, and we're working through what came out right now.
That's exactly what we wanted to learn. Thanks, Derry. And and for Derry's sake, we've been going through the proposal, and we've tuned it up a little bit, and so Darryl, what do you think is our next step here? Are there from Hussein or Matt or Chris? Do you have thoughts about if we want to move the loan, the first bullet for the loans, to a higher amount, or would you rather just leave it where it is?
I'm okay with increasing the amount of the loan, specifically because it says up to, and you can obviously, like you said, make a decision based on the person. And also, I think we just don't know who will or won't be applying. I think that's also kind of one of the key components to it, because I agree. I mean, if there's a small business that doesn't need that much money and they're more worthy, I mean, I would rather the dollars go to the people that are not being covered by all the other programs that we're talking about out there. And we as a community, I think that's our job as this board, is to really kind of look out for our community and figure out who is the most vulnerable in the business world and help them out. And so obviously you want to help as many people as you can with the limited amount of money we have in our bucket. But if there's a very worthy cause that needs, more than $50,000, we would hate to lose that person in our community as well. So it just kind of goes, we want to be flexible.
Okay.
I agree.
All right. Thank you. Matt, does that fit with your thinking?
Yeah, no, I'm fine to move it up. And I liked what Daryl had to say too. Like, we might just have some internal kind of benchmarks for each one of these buckets of money to say, oh, we're generally going to apply this generally, but we don't need to communicate that outwardly, of course, unless council asks us. But no, I'm fine moving it up.
And one of the things based on this conversation, I think that is good, is that if we go back to the section that says priority considerations, and this might be following up on Derry's comment, if we don't start typing, Sarah, but if we added a bullet that said a priority consideration would be applicants that are not eligible for other programs. So basically, we're going to give a priority consideration to applicants that slip through the cracks, or we're not eligible for, or we're denied. I mean, oh, it's already there. Thank you. I must have just not have read that well. But I think that's back to, so that we'll know enough about CARES Act and PPP and EIDL, and we know enough about those programs that if somebody applies to this fund and they clearly could qualify under a different program, we'll guide them there, I think. Don't you, Daryl? We would have the capacity to do that.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Members of the committee have other comments or things we'd like to discuss about the overview or the guidelines? So Sarah, under the revolving loan existing organization, it sounds like we have acceptance to have that be 250,000, expecting that we want to try to spread the money as broad as we possibly can, but we also don't want to limit, if we do have somebody that's been severely impacted, has fallen through the cracks in other programs, and we can help them here, we now have the room to be able to do that if they qualify and score high enough on our priority considerations.
Great. Do you want to throw in some suggestions as our resident banker here for rates and terms and all that stuff?
Well, I think in this environment, the PPP money was 1% per year. I've seen some other rates, in the 1 or 2%. Derry, do you happen to know if any of the other funds that were revolving loan funds, if they had an interest rate on that you'd see?
I do not. I think, yeah, I would want to research that before I give you a response.
Okay. All right. Maybe we start with, 1%, and that seems to be the rate that's been put in most of the other SBA programs. And then, just from being a banker, over 5 years is typically, I think the PPP money was over 10 years, I think. But if we're going to revolve our fund, I think that we probably want to try to, get the fund to actually revolve. And back to some of the other comments from Matt and Hussein about the levels, if you're going to repay back $100 or a few $100,000 over 5 years, even though 1% is a very favorable rate, you're still going to have some good future cash flow to be able to do that. How does that sound to others on the committee?
Sounds fine to me. Do we want to include any sort of language about, when those repayments start, like after a year? Like, I know with the EIDL, the second you draw the money, the clock starts ticking on the interest, but you have
Right.
until a year to start making those payments back.
Right.
Thanks, Matt. That is a great point.
Mhm.
Well, and it could be different for both loan programs. Does maybe the interest begins to accrue immediately and payments must commence within, 180 days or something like that? Because obviously there's still an impact, and you would hate to see loan proceeds just going right back into the repayment schedule. So maybe there is a deferred period where interest would accrue on the larger businesses, and maybe we make that as an offer. They could opt to begin to repay, but within, between 30 and 180 days or something like that.
Well, I think for this document, maybe, Sarah's typed, we could just put with a deferral period, and then that's as much definition as we offer here. And then
Excellent.
we can then determine, what's reasonable. And, if I'm making this up, but if suddenly there's a vaccine and everything gets really quick, then that means one way. And if it keeps getting worse and we go through another shutdown, it might look different. I think just saying there's going to be a deferral period, I think that'll speak for us. So do we want to talk about any of the recovery loan, We Love Norman recovery grant, and then the technical assistance training programs? Does anybody have other comments about those particular elements? They all seem to me to be, the We Love Norman, I could easily be talked into making that micro grant 10,000 rather than 5,000. In this day and age, 5,000 doesn't go very far.
That's true. We could say up to micro grants of up to 10,000.
Yeah, that sounds great. And then the technical
amount for this too, the 10,000, or increase this one as well?
I'd leave it. I'll leave that one alone. I think that's, again, it's a loan, so it could go to a higher amount if the committee chose to do that. It's going to be challenging for an applicant to be able to convince, their future revenues or how we want to make sure that they're going to be able to repay the loan. I think we'll be looking at the applicants pretty carefully, and so we could raise that to 100,000, even up to 100,000, and then under our underwriting criteria, we would be determining at what level do we want to try to fund businesses. But I'm open to suggestions from the committee on that.
Do we want to make that one revolving also?
Well, I think revolving loan to me is a line of credit that they could draw and pay back. Is that what we're thinking? And then the small business recovery loan is you get the loan and you just pay it back over time rather than being able to redraw the money in the future. But I think it could go either way if you have a preference.
I just misread it a little bit. I just read with 50 or less and then 10 or less. So I was thinking, well, the second one's going to be for smaller businesses, but really they could apply for either. So I don't know that it needs a revolve.
Yeah. What do you think about moving that recovery loan to 100,000 instead of 10?
I mean, as long as we have oversight, or the underwriting people have oversight of it, then I would just say, yeah, let's make it large. And if people need it, then we can review it and give it to them.
One line that the Oklahoma City program has on one of them, it says amount of negative financial impact due to COVID must be equal to or more than the amount of reimbursement requested. That's for a reimbursement grant. But we could include something like that. Like you can't take more than you actually were impacted.
Maybe we could put that in our overview, or some, where that's our general theory, is that the amount of funding you receive wouldn't be more than the amount of the negative impact you've suffered.
That's a hard one, to be honest, because you may have lost that much, but if you're looking future and you're looking at projected revenue, it may be, well, shoot, I don't know when this is going to turn out, so I may need to draw a little bit more than I actually lost, just based on what I see coming. So, but I'm open to be told I'm wrong.
No, I think that's a really good point. I don't think it hurts us to be silent on that, because we are trying to create a program that will catch people that have slipped through the cracks in other programs. So that's a really good point. Hossein or Chris, do you have thoughts about that?
Do we know who's going to be kind of reviewing every application?
Daryl, we've had some general conversations about a panel, underwriter panel of, people that do this for a living, but I don't know that we've actually gotten to the final thought about how we're going to do this.
We have not, and honestly, council's thoughts have kind of bounced back and forth, attempting to do it internally, which is not a situation staff looks forward to. One, there is a lack of expertise on our part. Two, we just don't have a lot of extra bodies to throw at an application process like this. It's not something we do regularly. So the other thought, and it was the more recent thought of council, is we would rely on some of our local business partners, like some of our local banks who do this on a regular basis, to underwrite that application process. And then, even on the loan administration side, there's probably some prep work that would have to happen in terms of some software to manage, loan balances, et cetera, unless those loans were administered, through a local bank that would provide that service for some fee, just so they could manage, what happens when a payment gets missed, who sends out the notification, hey, you're 30 days or 60 days behind. And then, so it is still relatively open. And I think if EDAB in our staff report, we can deliver that communication to council that says, we recommend we rely on some of our local business partners through the application and underwriting process. That keeps it, independent and objective. I think that's probably our safest approach. We don't want this to become politicized in any way.
But I do believe that is something they will talk about when this is presented to them, because they mentioned it more than once when we were talking about calling the election, almost kind of implying that council may be some of the ones reviewing, but I don't know that that was ever the intent. But I think it'll be really important to them that it, be independent, and they will probably want to hear a little bit more about that. We currently have this scheduled to bring to council the recommendation at a study session on August the 18th, so that it's out there prior to the vote on the 25th, and the public will be able to see, what it looks like, and we'll have been able to hear council's input to it as well before the election. We obviously couldn't have it approved necessarily before the election, but it could actually be on the agenda for the 25th, the same day as the election, if everything was hashed out, by that time. So, just
study session,
yes.
Madam Clerk, I think makes the most sense. That just provides a more relaxed environment to allow a discussion. If the board is comfortable with that, I think to take these final thoughts along with some text, some context in terms of recommendations on how to process loan applications and then how we might administer the program over time. I think we put the recommendation on the table. Council will kick that around on the 18th, and then the final version for adoption happens on election day. But the public will have a great opportunity to listen in and learn on the 18th in advance of the election. And I think that's the big value.
So to follow on Brenda's comment, if we say in our summary that the council, we would recommend the council be involved in appointing or creating the underwriting panel. And that way, because I'm like you, Brenda, I've heard a lot that they really want to have their fingers on this, which is, it's public money. It's, I think if Dr. Holmes was on the call, he would say that elected officials need to be the ones that are touching, the money like that. So I think if we recommend that the council, appoint or develop the underwriting panel, do you think that would satisfy their desire to be involved?
I think that's a good idea, because I think that then they would have input into who the panel is, or if it's a local banking institution or whatever. But I think it's a really good idea. And if you all think we need 2 bites at the apple before the election, we could actually present this next Tuesday at the council conference prior to the regular meeting. And then that way, if they did have input or changes that they would like to see, we could still bring it back on the 18th. That's just something to consider. Your thoughts on that. It's available if we need to do that.
Chuck, I've got to go to another meeting in Oklahoma City right now that I'm late for, but
Okay.
I support what you're saying. And if you want me to try to hook up, I can do Zoom in the car if I need to. So
Okay.
You all just call me if you need my rep. Okay.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks for your time very much. Thank you.
Was that, did you just lose quorum?
We did, but if she can, if she can hook back up with us so we can do a vote, if you feel like it's totally necessary. We could still take this as the consensus of the board without an actual vote.
And if we're only taking it to the pre-council conference next Tuesday night for their initial review, one, that gives us some time parameters. So, the conversation won't draw on for hours and hours, but it'll definitely give us the opportunity to add those comments to what could be a more detailed discussion on the final version on the 18th. So, I don't know if we necessarily need a quorum vote to put the document before council in a pre-council conference next Tuesday night. I think as long as there's consensus of the EDAB board members still on, that's just the document we would place before council for their first review.
Okay. I think that sounds okay.
If I may, Mr. Chair, I think the committee EDAB should be recommending to council that the applications be reviewed by an independent body. That is, because a lot of the work involved in reviewing these applications is just flat administrative stuff, making sure that they have submitted all the documentation and reading it. And council's not going to do that. They may want to have their hands on it, but let's say that each application is going to be an average of 15 pages, and there's going to be at least 100 or 200 applications. They're not going to read that. And the committee should be recommending that an organization be hired, like a bank or some administrative type organization, who is charged and paid for reviewing those applications. And yes, some of the bond money could be used to pay that organization, but those administrative functions should be out of the control of the council. I think it's a very bad idea to have them reviewing every individual application, because they're not going to do it.
Yeah, my comments, I completely agree. And my comment was that we would recommend I do think the council's going to want to have influence, but if our summary says we recommend the council appoint a panel to oversee the acceptance and review of the applications, then that might let them know that they'll have that influence, but they're going to appoint somebody else to do it. They're not going to be doing it. So I think
But
I
if
agree
you
with
say a panel, they are going to interpret that to mean each council member is going to appoint an individual to this panel or this board. And again, I think it should be an independent organization. That's, because again, most of the work is administrative. Just flat reading the applications and making sure that everything is there and in order.
Well, Anthony, I agree with you 100%, but I also understand and have listened to the council dialogue, and I understand what Brenda's saying, that I think the council is going to want to have more influence over how this gets set up. And then hopefully with our dialogue, we can say, well, there is some advances to the council to move the decision-making over onto a different group, or if panel isn't a good word, what is a good word? But, that will clearly state that the council doesn't have they're going to delegate that administrative work. I agree with that. But maybe Anthony, you and Daryl and Catherine can think about how to put a paragraph on the relief package guidelines that would summarize what you just said, but also let the council know that they would be voting on or establishing that process, even though they wouldn't be on the panel or the organization. Or I'm a little reluctant as a banker to say, yeah, you need to go hire a local financial institution and pay them to do this. I mean, that might come up eventually, but I'm reluctant to have a document come out of a committee that I chair that says you got to hire a local bank to do this.
I know that might sound self-serving, but you would do an RFP process, and whether it's Armstrong Bank or Arvest or DM Wealth Management or somebody, even if it is that you're going to do an RFP to hire that organization to do the administrative work, and maybe they make a recommendation to this panel that's been appointed to the council on what loans should get approved and that sort of thing. But again, the upfront work of reviewing the applications should not be done by the council or even a panel of 7 or 10 people that the council appoints, or even EDAP for that matter. Because again, for lack of a better term, a lot of this is grunt work. Just did this organization submit the application properly? Reading the application, did they get their tax information in? All of that sort of stuff. And that's hours worth of work. Let's say 2 hours worth of work for each individual application. It's 15 pages. There's going to be 100 or 200 of them. That should be somebody.
I think we all agree on that. And then other members of the committee, it's okay with me if we delegate that, Daryl, to you and Anthony and Catherine, to put that paragraph or sentences together that lines that out. That it's, I'm happy with that.
Excellent.
Matt, do you and Hossein have thoughts about that?
Well, the reason I even asked the question to see kind of, I guess, riled up the hornet's nest on that one. So my apologies. But,
That's a great question.
It's actually kind of because Matt brings up the good point of, how are we going to be allocating the funds? It's just a question of to be reviewing it and figuring out who needs this much, who doesn't need this much. And for the exact reason you don't want something coming out of this committee that says a small bank should be getting something, or the reason, I try to be quiet when there's real estate developer things. I don't want people to think that this is a political issue, and so we're only helping out our friends or people on council who are friends, things like that. I think it's important to have people who do this for a living kind of allocate the portions and the amounts, because again, when you guys are talking about real estate developers and people who own rental properties and stuff, sure, I have knowledge about it, but I don't want to give input as to, how much we should or shouldn't allocate to them, because obviously I have a bias. That's my industry. And so I don't want to seem to be biased in any way, shape, or form. But I think it is important to the citizens of our community to know that, we're doing this for the specific reason of helping the most vulnerable in our community. And it kind of goes back to what we keep discussing is, how do we know how to allocate? Let's make the pie bigger that we're allowed to give people, but how much of it are we going to give and things of that nature? So I'm certainly in agreement.
Great. Matt, do you have comments?
Not really. I mean, I think it sounds good. I mean, we do need a team that knows what they're doing to look at applications. Totally agree with Anthony there on that. So no new comments for me.
Okay. I had thought, Anthony, maybe just to be specific about this, I know we've really spent a lot of time, that you've got some good local underwriters here that have done a lot of this. I mean, you've got local banks that have put in, probably all the banks together did 10 or 15,000 PPP loans. And so rather than have, hire a bank or whatever, I think you could have an administrative support, get paid for that, and then pick 4 or 5 good underwriters from the local banks, not any one particular bank, and on a panel. And then, I do this all the time where applications are taken, summaries are performed, the background work is done, and you sit down and go through the applications on a scoring process. And over a period of several hours, you come up with what the recommendations are. So hiring, those people who know how to take applications and sort information, things like that, makes sense. But then have, representatives of financial services industry, and I guess I'm thinking of on a volunteer basis. It's no different than the financial impact panel of United Way. It's no different than, other places where we work in the community to, try to determine, how to help the most vulnerable. And so I can't commit anybody else, of course, but I think it might be reasonable to expect that we could have, local financial experts that would be on a panel or on an underwriting group that would look at these, on a complimentary basis, or, on something, so people aren't getting paid to say yes or no. But I do agree that the mechanics of getting the applications and making sure that they're appropriately completed and the information is attached properly, we sure should hire some group to do that.
Excellent. What we can do is, we want to be mindful of your time. We will send out this document as it's been modified to the EDAB board. And what we'll do is, we're going to put together the staff report to initiate the conversation at next Tuesday night's council conference. We'll send that out to the EDAB board too. All of our council meetings are virtual and via Zoom for the foreseeable future. So what we could do is invite the EDAP board to be on Zoom with council at 5:30 next Tuesday night, and do the screen share and walk through and answer questions and take council's comments. And then it'll give us one more week to put those comments into text, and then be ready for a study session on the 18th, if that works for the board.
Can I go ahead and change that number there on that second package?
To 100,000. I support that.
Okay.
For the small business nonprofit recovery loan.
Yep. Okay.
Oh, two. Yep.
Okay.
And honestly, I guess as nobody wants to bite off more than they can chew. And of course, it may pan out in the underwriting if they are attempting to bite off more than they could chew.
I think so. For on the 11th, I am not available that evening, but I think that if they have comments about, where we are so far, that Daryl, I certainly think with your being involved in all this, that you'd be able to field those questions in concert with what the committee's discussions have been. And then
And you guys have been great. I really appreciate this. And I'm glad you guys actually, the questions, the perspectives you bring to the conversation. This is so much better a document than it was when it was just staff's initial thoughts. So I think by the time council's ready to act upon the final version, there's a lot of thought that went into this, and I think the community will recognize it.
Okay. Now on the 18th, I am available and can easily dial in to a Zoom call for that. I'm sure others might. And that's the study session you said where they'll really be talking in detail about the kind of final format of this. Do I understand that
correct? Yep.
Okay. So I'll put the 18th on my calendar. What time, Brenda, would that happen?
5:30.
Okay.
One other thing, I know we had as a kind of a follow-up, but if I recall, Chuck, I think you said you wouldn't be available next Thursday on the 13th. If this body wanted to come together again after Daryl introduces it to council next Tuesday, prior to the 18th, I mean, we can certainly make that happen. And it doesn't have to be that Thursday necessarily if some other time works better. I mean, I'm just throwing that out there, however you want to handle that.
Okay. Okay. Do we have preferences from other members of the committee? And why don't we just plan on that?
Sorry, what was the date? I'm trying to look on my calendar.
Right now, we set aside the 13th, which is a week from today, but I thought that Chuck had a conflict with that day.
Well, my conflict is the mayor's roundtable, and so I mean I can do EDAB instead. I mean that's not a problem.
What was the alternative that you were proposing, Brenda?
Other than the 13th, I didn't really have one.
Okay.
But I mean, I'm open to.
Well, if you want to propose a date, that's fine. My Wednesdays and Thursdays are usually my best days. Mondays and Tuesdays are pretty horrible for me. And Wednesdays and Thursdays are usually better days for me.
Okay.
Brenda, let's just plan on the 13th then.
Okay.
I mean, we'll just keep that date and I'll make sure I'm available.
Okay.
And we'll do 8:30 again. Is that right?
Yes, and I'm going to see if I haven't heard back from Dr. Holmes the last 2 times I've emailed to see if there's something else going on with his email, or I'm going to try to reach out to him.
Chuck, I don't know if the 14th I'm available too, but I don't want
to. No, it's fine. No, that will be just fine. The 13th is fine.
I'll have to call in on the 13th. I'll be on the road, but I can do that.
Okay. Yeah, the 14th is council retreat, so we will not be available that day.
Well, much appreciated, Mr. Chair. I think that was all the business we had lined out. We don't have a quorum, so we can't approve the minutes. We'll approve those at our next meeting.
Okay. So we'll try to get some calls out for the meeting on the 13th, next Thursday, and see if we can't make sure we have a quorum. And can we ask you all to, once the document's reworded, just send it out to us just whenever it gets done. Sarah, thank you for your Scrivener skills this morning.
And Sarah, I don't want to be that guy, but I did notice a little bit higher up, one of the lines that we added needed the word "the" in it. So I don't see your screen, but it was one of the bullets towards the top, maybe that first section that we added. There was something that we added that needed to say "the" something something. So not to be that
Matt,
guy.
I love your background. Oh my gosh, I want to be there.
It was in honor of Sarah's trip that she took all over the northern United States.
Excellent.
Okay. Well, we'll even though we're not formally convened, we'll informally adjourn, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody on this Zoom call 8:30 next Thursday, and we'll look forward to receiving the document redrafted. And if you have contact with council, it's not a bad idea to tell them what we're doing and suggest that, you know, we're working on this if they have thoughts or ideas. And then I'm assuming that this next Tuesday, there will be some dialogue about this at the planning session, right?
Yeah, the pre-conference,
Pre-conference. And that's at 5.
5:30. 5:30.
And
if
say that date again.
the-
Next Tuesday.
August the 11th at 5:30. And it's their pre-conference prior to the regular meeting that starts at 6:30. So it's a shorter window.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I can probably dial into that for the first 15 or 20 minutes if that would work.
Okay. Well, I will
Okay.
send the invite to you all as well. And I'm actually going to go do the Zoom invite for the 13th after we get off this call, so I won't forget. And maybe that'll give enough notice to the other members that they can get it on their calendar.
Yeah, that'll be great.
Well, and I apologize, I was late this morning. My computer wasn't working, so I had to go steal my wife's laptop, download Zoom. I mean, just technology is great when it works. When
Yeah.
it's not, it's a little bit of a challenge. But
Well, we appreciate
so I'm
you.
sorry,
Appreciate
I was
getting
actually
on.
not waiting on you, Brenda, so I just couldn't figure out how to make my computer work this morning.
Understood.
Well, we appreciate your time.
Special thanks to everyone, and we'll sign off now. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Have a
everybody.
great day.